Tank warfare in World War II wasn't just a battle of machines. It was a battle of nerves. Every soldier who climbed into one of those iron beasts knew the odds. The chances of survival inside a tank were among the lowest of any unit on the front lines. In the U.S. Army, a tank crewman's life expectancy in combat could be measured in days once fighting intensified. For Soviet crews on the Eastern Front, sometimes in hours. Each man carried that knowledge with him. The driver, staring out through a narrow slit, praying he'd see the flash of an enemy shell in time. The gunner, his hands slick with sweat, adjusting the sights while hearing the enemy's engines grow louder. And the commander, his head barely above the hatch, trying to stay alive long enough to get his men home. They were trapped between two extremes, total control and total helplessness. They could unleash destruction with a single shot. And yet, one small mistake could turn their entire world into a furnace. They burned like matchsticks. Among Allied soldiers, there was a dark saying, whispered, never joked about. A tank doesn't explode, it cooks off. When armor was pierced, the heat could reach thousands of degrees in an instant. Fuel ignited, ammunition detonated. Hydraulic fluid burst into flame, and the men inside had seconds to react. Seconds to claw their way out of a hatch, or die screaming inside a cage of fire. British troops in North Africa used to watch from afar as enemy tanks went up in flames. Sometimes they'd see hatches fly open, silhouettes of men on fire stumbling out, falling to the sand. And sometimes there was no movement at all, just a burning hulk, black smoke twisting into the desert sky. Those sights weren't forgotten. They haunted the survivors long after the guns fell silent. A machine built for death and for dying in. To understand the horror, you need to imagine the inside of a WWII tank. It wasn't spacious. The Sherman, the most produced tank of the war, was barely large enough for its 5-man crew to move. They sat shoulder to shoulder, knees against metal, heads inches from fuel lines and shells. When the armor was struck, that metal became shrapnel, even without a full penetration, spalling. Tiny fragments of steel ricocheting through the cabin could tear flesh apart. Noise was constant. Engines roared behind their backs. The gun's recoil shook every bone in their bodies. The smell of sweat, gun oil, and exhaust was so thick that veterans later said they could never forget it. Even decades later, that smell could bring them right back inside the tank. The first flames of modern armored warfare. Tank warfare wasn't new in 1939, but World War II made it monstrous. In the early years, during the Blitzkrieg, the German panzers seemed unstoppable. They rolled through Poland, France, and the Low Countries like steel thunder. But victory came at a price. And even the Germans quickly learned that their panzers were far from invincible. When shells pierced their armor, the same nightmare unfolded. Inside, crewmen could be torn apart, crushed or burned alive before they even realized they'd been hit. Fuel tanks ruptured, ammunition cooked off, and the confined space turned into an inferno in seconds. A German tanker once wrote in his diary, "When a shell hits, there is a flash, white, blinding. You can't tell if you are dead or alive until the fire reaches you. Then you know." That diary was recovered from a destroyed Panzer near Kursk. The man who wrote it never made it out. The illusion of safety. To civilians back home, tank crews looked invincible. Propaganda films showed them grinning in their uniforms, standing proudly beside gleaming machines of war. The truth was far darker. Inside, the armor that promised protection became a trap. Every layer meant to keep the enemy out also kept the fire in. A hit from an anti-tank round didn't always blow the tank apart. Often it cracked the armor, just enough for molten fragments to spray inside, igniting fuel and ammunition. The men didn't always die instantly. Some screamed for help. Others beat at the hatches, trying to escape through doors that had been welded shut by heat. There are recorded cases of rescuers arriving too late, finding men half out of the hatch, burned black, hands still gripping the edges. There are few first-hand accounts, for obvious reasons, but the ones that exist are chilling. One American tanker, Corporal James Hall, survived when his Sherman was hit in Normandy. He wrote later, "The blast knocked me forward. The loader next to me was gone, just gone. The driver was on fire. I climbed out through the commander's hatch, and I remember seeing my hands. They were burning too. I rolled in the dirt until it went out. Then I realized I was alone. Another account from a Soviet T-34 crewman near Kursk. When the German round hit us, it was like the sun exploded inside. My friend Mikhail screamed once. I never saw him again. I kicked open the hatch and jumped. The tank behind us fired while I was still on the ground. The heat of our burning tank was so strong I couldn't go near it. My comrades were still inside. These testimonies, scattered, incomplete, are what remain of the men whose stories ended inside those machines. The sound of death on tracks. To the infantry, tank battles were a sight both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The ground shook. The air thundered. But when a tank was hit, the sound was like nothing else. A deep metallic crack followed by a hollow boom, then the roar of fire. Sometimes the tanks exploded outright, hurling turrets dozens of meters away. Other times they burned slowly, the heat warping the steel, paint bubbling and peeling as the fire consumed the interior. A commander watching from a nearby ridge might see his comrades' tanks turn into blazing pyres one by one. And he'd know his turn could come next. Inside the mind of a tanker, psychologists who later studied WWII veterans found something remarkable. Tankers had some of the highest rates of combat, stress, and nightmares of any group in the war. Why? Because of the confinement, the helplessness, the sheer horror of being buried alive in metal. One veteran said, "Every time I close my eyes, I see the hatch closing. It's the sound of that steel door sealing shut. That's the sound of death." They lived with constant dread. Every creak of the armor, every ping of enemy fire against the hull could be the start of their end. And yet, they stayed inside. Not because they wanted to, but because their brothers were counting on them. To leave the tank meant abandoning the only weapon that could protect the infantry. It was courage beyond measure and fear beyond words. Inside the mind of a tanker, psychologists who later studied WWII veterans found something remarkable. Tankers had some of the highest rates of combat, stress, and nightmares of any group in the war. Why? Because of the confinement, the helplessness, the sheer horror of being buried alive in metal. One veteran said, "Every time I close my eyes, I see the hatch closing. It's the sound of that steel door sealing shut. That's the sound of death." They lived with constant dread. Every creak of the armor, every ping of enemy fire against the hull could be the start of their end. And yet, they stayed inside. Not because they wanted to, but because their brothers were counting on them. To leave the tank meant abandoning the only weapon that could protect the infantry. It was courage beyond measure and fear beyond words. The Ronson, the tank that lit up every time. British crews were among the first to give it a nickname. The Ronson, named after a popular cigarette lighter brand whose slogan read, "Lights every time." It wasn't meant as a joke. It was grim truth. German tankers on the other side had their own name for it. Tommy Cocker. The Tommy Cooker. Because to them, the Shermans were like mobile ovens, burning the British and American crews alive. Why did it happen so often? Because the Sherman's design prioritized speed and production over protection. Its armor, 51 millimeters at its thickest, was no match for the 80 millimeter guns of German Tigers or Panthers. One hit to the side, and the result was almost always catastrophic. Inside, the Sherman's ammunition was stored along the hull, without proper insulation. When a shell penetrated the armor, hot fragments, spall, flew through the interior, igniting the powder charges of the stored shells. Within seconds, the tank's interior turned into an inferno. The crew had no chance. Of a Sherman death. A Sherman rolling forward through a French hedgerow. The engine roaring, mud spattering its sides. The crew, 5 men, are alert, tense. Then a flash. A German 88 fires from the tree line half a mile away. The shell pierces the Sherman's frontal armor like paper. Inside, it's chaos. The driver slumps over, killed instantly. The gunner is thrown against the breech, screaming, clutching at his burned face. The tank's interior glows orange, then white. Ammunition begins to detonate in rapid succession. A cook-off that rips the turret from its base and sends it spinning into the air. From a distance, it looks like a volcano has erupted. Black smoke pours out, fire licking through the hatches. The men inside, if they're not killed immediately, have seconds. Some try to climb out, their uniforms on fire. Others never move. And then there's silence, just the crackle of the burning wreck and the smell of fuel and flesh. Private Charles Reynolds of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division survived one such hit in Normandy. He later wrote, "We got hit once, maybe twice. The next thing I know, I'm upside down. I felt heat like I'd never known. I couldn't see anything, just orange. Someone was screaming. I didn't know who. Then I realized it was me. Reynolds escaped through the commander's hatch. But the rest of his crew never did. He spent the next 2 hours crawling through mud. His hands blistered, his skin hanging in strips from his arms. Another tanker, British Sergeant Tom Kelly, described the sound of death inside a Sherman. When it goes up, there's a hissing first, like a kettle. Then a pop, then a roar. You can smell them before you see them. I'll never forget that smell, hot metal and meat. He was 19 years old, a built to burn. The truth was simple. The Sherman was designed by necessity, not perfection. American generals understood they couldn't outgun the German tanks, so instead they chose to outnumber them. While the Germans built a few thousand Tigers and Panthers, the Americans built tens of thousands of Shermans. Quantity over quality, logistics over life. It was a war of math. And the men inside the tanks were the ones who paid for the equation. A Tiger could destroy a Sherman from over a mile away. The Sherman's 75mm gun, by contrast, often couldn't penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at any range. To win, Sherman crews had to rely on maneuver, surprise, and luck. Outgunned, outarmored, but not outfought. Despite their fear, Sherman crews fought bravely. They learned to use smoke speed and teamwork to outmaneuver the heavier German tanks. 3 or 4 Shermans might circle a single Tiger attacking from the flanks where the armor was thinner, but each maneuver was a gamble. For every Tiger destroyed, several Shermans might burn. At the Battle of Villers-Bocage in June 1944, German ace Michael Wittmann and his Tiger I ambushed a British armored column. In just 15 minutes, he destroyed 14 tanks and 15 other vehicles, most of them Shermans. Eyewitnesses said the road was littered with blackened hulls and bodies, the air filled with the stench of burning fuel. Wittmann himself would later die in his tank, proving that even the hunter could become prey, but that day, he showed the world how deadly the imbalance had become. The smell of death in Normandy. In the summer of 1944, Normandy's fields weren't green. They were black and gray, burned-out carcasses of tanks marking every hedgerow. Crows perched on twisted metal. Smoke hung low for days. Villagers spoke of the constant thunder, the sound of steel grinding steel, and then silence. American medics often refused to go near burning tanks until hours after the flames died down. The heat was too intense, the air too toxic. When they did, they found what the fire left behind: bones fused to metal, melted helmets, the ghosts of men burned into their seats. They'd scrape what was left into small bags and mark the wreck. Crew unrecoverable. Sometimes there wasn't even that. What fear does to a crew. Tank crews learned to hide their fear behind bravado. They gave their tanks nicknames. Widowmaker, Lucky Lady, Dead Man's Ride. They'd paint pin-up girls on the sides, crack jokes before battles, anything to feel human again. But inside, they knew the truth. Every time they climbed in, they were gambling with fate. Once the hatch slammed shut, there was no easy way out. If the tank caught fire, the flames could reach 1,000 degrees Celsius in under 10 seconds. That was enough to melt aluminum and human flesh. One tanker recalled, "When we saw a Sherman burning, we didn't look at it for long. You just kept your eyes ahead. Because if you looked too long, you saw your own death, buried in their machines." After battles, recovery teams faced an awful task. They had to clear wrecks, recover remains, and salvage parts from burned tanks. The smell was unforgettable. Many soldiers described it as sweet, a word that feels wrong, but they all used it. Sweet, heavy, clinging, it stayed in their nostrils for days. Sometimes they couldn't even tell how many men had been inside. The remains fused together, indistinguishable. Metal, bone, and flesh as one. Those who survived carried guilt that never left. They'd see their friends' tanks still burning in their dreams. They'd hear the screams, the pounding on hatches, the helplessness. It was a kind of trauma words could never fully express. Lessons paid in blood. By late 1944, American engineers finally responded. They began adding wet stowage, water jackets around ammunition, racks to reduce fires. It worked. The chance of a catastrophic fire after a penetration dropped dramatically. But for many, it was too late. Tens of thousands of men had already died in those early, flammable coffins. Their deaths taught lessons that shaped modern tank design, better armor placement, safer ammunition storage, and improved escape hatches. The Sherman's reputation would slowly recover after the war, but the men who served inside never forgot the nickname. They'd whisper it even decades later in veteran halls and reunions. Ronson, the myth of invincibility. When Germany unleashed its blitzkrieg in 1939, the Panzers were at the heart of it all. Sleek, disciplined, terrifyingly efficient, they rolled into Poland, France, and the Low Countries with unstoppable precision. To the world, it looked like nothing could destroy them. But the secret truth? Many of those early tanks, the Panzer I and II, were barely armored at all. Their guns were small, their armor paper-thin. Crews inside were protected by little more than a few centimeters of steel. They won not because of their strength, but because of their speed, coordination, and fearlessness. But war is cruel. Tactics can win a battle, but in the end, every man is just flesh inside a furnace waiting to happen. The turning of the tide. By 1943, things had changed. The Germans now faced the Soviet T-34, fast, powerful sloped armor that deflected shots that once killed. To counter it, Germany rolled out the Panther and Tiger tanks, machines of near-mythic status. Their guns could tear through Allied tanks from over a kilometer away. Their armor could shrug off most hits, but they came with a curse. The engines overheated, fuel lines ruptured, transmissions failed, and worst of all, when they burned, they really burned. The Tiger's thick armor trapped heat like an oven. Once fire started inside, it created a pressure so fierce it could blow the hatches clean off. Men were crushed by their own seats, their bones breaking as the tank buckled under explosions from its own ammunition. The Tiger's last roar. Picture this, a Tiger I somewhere near Kursk, 1943, the greatest tank battle in history. Over 6,000 tanks clashing across open fields. Dust, smoke, thunder. Inside one Tiger, a 5-man crew, veterans, calm, experienced. They've killed before and they expect to again. Their 88 Miller cannon is already smoking from constant fire. They are kings of the battlefield. Then, a hit. A Soviet anti-tank gun, hidden behind wreckage, lands a perfect shot. Not through the front, but through the side engine plate. A jet of molten metal slices through the compartment. Fuel ignites. The loader screams. The fire spreads faster than thought. They try to open the hatches, but the pressure inside locks them tight. The tank becomes a furnace. In less than 30 seconds, everyone inside is dead. When the wreck is found hours later, the armor is still glowing red. A Soviet soldier wrote in his diary that night, "The Germans have fine machines, but when they die like devils, screaming inside their iron, crushed under their own might." Not all Panzer deaths came from enemy fire. Some came from the Panzers themselves. In the chaos of retreat, especially in Russia, entire columns of tanks were abandoned when engines failed or fuel ran out. Crews tried to escape on foot, but some tanks, stuck in mud or snow, were still running when shells hit nearby. Tracks would spin, collapse, or even roll over fleeing men. In the dark, with smoke and confusion everywhere, men were crushed under their own treads. Pulverized beneath the same machines they had trusted for protection. In retreat after retreat, Stalingrad, Kursk, the Dnieper, thousands of German tankers died not from enemy shells, but from exhaustion, starvation, and accidents born of desperation. A sergeant from the 4th Panzer Division wrote, "When the fuel was gone, we blew them up. But some men stayed too long. One explosion buried 2 of ours under the turret. We couldn't dig them out. We just left them there, their bodies under their beloved Tiger, the curse of the Panther." The Panther tank was supposed to be Germany's perfect answer to the T-34. Fast, deadly, beautifully engineered. But it was cursed by complexity. On the battlefield, Panthers often broke down before they ever saw combat. Engines seized, gearboxes jammed. Some caught fire spontaneously due to poor fuel line sealing. In one notorious incident near Caen in 1944, an entire battalion of Panthers caught fire on the road. No enemy nearby, just mechanical failure and bad luck. The fuel ignited beneath the crew compartments, trapping men before they could even open the hatches. The road became a trail of blackened hulks, each one with 5 men still inside, burned alive before they even reached the fight. An SS tanker later said, "The enemy didn't kill us. Our own machines did. The fall of the hunters." As the Allies pushed into France and the Soviet armies advanced from the east, the once feared panzers became relics of a dying empire. Their crews, once elite, proud, disciplined, now fought knowing the war was lost. They held their lines anyway, loyal to each other if not to the regime that sent them there. In the Battle of the Bulge, in late 1944, the cold was merciless. Engines froze. Oil turned to sludge. Panzer crews used small stoves inside their tanks for warmth. Dangerous. Desperate acts. One careless spark, and the whole interior became a gas chamber of fire. Entire crews were found sitting upright, frozen or burned black, eyes open, as if the war had simply stopped mid-breath. The psychology of a panzerman. Survivors from panzer units rarely spoke after the war, not because they were all loyal. Nazis, many weren't, but because they couldn't. They'd seen things that language simply failed to capture. Imagine knowing that every hit might turn your tank into a crematorium. That if your engine caught, you'd be trapped inside, clawing at doors that wouldn't open. They called it Feuertod, the fire death. It was one of the most feared fates in the Wehrmacht. A German tanker, captured in 1945, told his American interrogators, "We envied your men. When your tanks burned, they burned fast. Ours, they roasted us slow. When steel melts flesh." After battles, the wrecks of Tigers and Panthers told silent stories. Even Allied soldiers who had no pity for the enemy hesitated before opening those blackened hatches. Inside, they often found what they called shadow corpses. Bodies burned so completely that only outlines remained on the walls. The last positions of the men as they died. In some cases, tank recovery crews refused to touch the remains. They sealed the hatches and marked them with paint. Crew inside, leave. Those tanks were left on battlefields for months, silent tombs in the mud, until scavengers and time finally claimed them. The price of pride. Hitler once said the Panzer was the fist of the Reich, and for a time it was true. But as the war dragged on, those steel fists clenched too tightly, crushing the very men who wielded them. Germany's obsession with perfection, thicker armor, bigger guns, came at a terrible cost. Machines so heavy they broke their own backs. And crews who went to war knowing their chances of survival were fading. By 1945, the might of the Panzer divisions had been reduced to desperate. Remnants, scattered, outnumbered, out of fuel. Men drove their Tigers into forests, fired their last shells, and then destroyed their own tanks to avoid capture. Sometimes they didn't even bother to leave first. A diary found in the wreck of a Panther near Berlin contained a final note. "We will not surrender. The tank is our grave. The iron beast of the motherland." The T-34 was the Red Army's pride. The machine that would help defeat Hitler's legions. Sloped armor, wide tracks, a powerful gun, it was revolutionary for its time. Fast, simple, effective. But that simplicity came with a brutal truth. It protected the machine more than the men inside. The crew compartments were small, cramped, unventilated. There were no comfort systems, no insulation, no mercy. In winter, temperatures inside dropped below freezing. In summer, when the tank fought for hours, it became an oven. A T-34 crewman once said, "You didn't fight in the tank. You fought with the tank. It was alive. It bit, it burned, and it killed. Fire and steel in the snow." On the battlefield, the T-34 was terrifying. Its 76mm cannon could shred German Panzer III and IV tanks. Its armor deflected small-caliber shells, and its speed gave the Red Army the edge it desperately needed. But when the German 88s came, all that changed. The flat plains of Kursk, Smolensk, and Stalingrad became slaughterhouses. German shells tore through T-34s by the hundreds. Each hit turned the inside into a furnace, flames fed by diesel fuel, ammunition, and the bodies of the crew. In the cold Russian night, the fields glowed orange with burning tanks. The snow melted around them, leaving steaming craters, the last graves of men who never escaped. The inside of a Soviet death trap. Inside a T-34, there were 4 or 5 men, sometimes just 3 when losses ran high. The commander doubled as the gunner. The loader had to handle shells weighing 15 kilograms in freezing temperatures. Visibility was poor, the noise deafening. But worst of all was the heat when struck. Soviet engineers designed the T-34 with diesel fuel, which was less flammable than gasoline, but that didn't make it safe. When shells pierced the armor, diesel sprayed like mist, coating everything: walls, uniforms, skin. And when that mist caught fire, it became liquid hell. There are accounts of men being cooked alive, their screams muffled by the roaring engines and gunfire. In many cases, the driver couldn't even escape. His only hatch was directly above him, and if the turret jammed, it sealed shut. He'd die there, trapped beneath his comrades' feet, as fire consumed everything. The cost of courage. Soviet tankers didn't have the luxury of hesitation. When ordered to attack, they attacked, even if it meant driving straight into German guns. Commissars behind them made sure of it. Retreat was death either way, so they advanced. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of T-34s charging across the plains, knowing half would never come back. It wasn't strategy, it was sacrifice. A Red Army veteran later wrote, "We went forward not because we were brave, but because there was no backward." In those moments, the T-34 became less a weapon and more a coffin that moved on command. The burning plains of Kursk. The Battle of Kursk, July 1943. The largest tank battle in history. Over 6,000 tanks clashed across the Russian steppe. The air was thick with smoke and dust, the ground trembling under the weight of thousands of engines. A Soviet tanker, Lieutenant Yuri Klimov, described it years later. "We could not see the enemy, only fire. The tanks ahead were burning, black smoke everywhere. When a Tiger hit one, it exploded and pieces of metal rained on us. You smell oil, fire, and flesh. That is how you know you are alive." At Kursk, the T-34s charged wave after wave. Some reached German lines, ramming the enemy panzers head-on, detonating themselves in suicide strikes. Others burned before they ever fired a shot. The fields after the battle were described as a plain of steel corpses. Tens of thousands of men died inside machines that were supposed to save them. Inside the Soviet war machine. Unlike their German or American counterparts, Soviet crews rarely had time to mourn. If a tank was destroyed, the survivors were reassigned, the same day to a new machine, sometimes with their friends' blood still on the seats. They'd scrape off the ashes, reload the gun, and drive again. There were no elaborate funerals, no medals for dying. Only new orders, new targets, new deaths. The T-34 was easy to replace. Its crews were not. But to the Soviet High Command, it was a numbers game. For every tank lost, 2 more rolled off the line. For every man burned alive, 3 more were trained to take his place. Victory by attrition, paid for with human fire. The silent terror of the hatch. One of the most haunting fears among Soviet tankers was getting stuck. The hatches of the T-34 often jammed when struck or warped by heat. Crews learned to keep them slightly open during battle, a dangerous gamble, because open hatches made them vulnerable to grenades and shrapnel. But the alternative was worse, being sealed inside a burning tomb. A Soviet gunner recalled, "I kept the hatch open even in the snow. If we were hit, I wanted the cold air to meet me, not the fire. Even so, many never escaped. When the battlefield quieted, Soviet soldiers sometimes found lines of burned tanks with the hatches open, half-melted hands frozen in place. Men who had almost made it out. The smell of victory and death. For those who survived the T-34's infernos, the smell was something they could never forget. Burned oil, charred rubber, cooked metal, and beneath it all, the faint, unmistakable scent of death. Veterans said they could smell a burning tank before they could see it, and when they did see it, they'd look away. Because inside, the ghosts of comrades still sat at their posts, silhouettes of men, their outlines seared into the armor by the fire. They'd leave the tanks there, scattered across the fields. Silent monuments to sacrifice and suffering. Red engineering, black reality. The T-34's design was both genius and tragedy. It could be built quickly, repaired easily, and operated by uneducated soldiers. Its armor, though sloped, couldn't withstand the increasingly powerful German guns. Its turret was so cramped that reloading under fire was nearly impossible. But none of that mattered to the Soviet High Command. For them, the T-34 was a tool of destiny, a hammer to break the German wall. No matter how many hammers were lost in the process, General Zhukov himself once said, "In this war, courage replaces armor." And courage was all most tankers had, the frozen graves. When winter came, The true horror of the Eastern Front revealed itself. Tanks destroyed in summer battles froze solid where they stood. The men inside, charred, frozen, fused with the steel and remained there until spring. When the thaw came, the Red Army would recover what was left. Sometimes only bones, sometimes nothing at all. Local villagers told stories of hearing strange noises in the snow, the echo of engines, the groan of metal, the cries of men long dead. Superstition grew, that the fields themselves were haunted by the souls of tankers who never escaped. To this day, farmers in those regions still uncover burned armor plates and bones when plowing their land. The price of the Eastern victory. By the end of the war, the Soviet Union had lost more than 80,000 tanks, most of them T-34s. Each one carried 4 or 5 men. That means more than 300,000 crewmen died inside these machines. Some records suggest even more. Entire platoons that simply disappeared. Never recorded, never buried. Their sacrifice was the backbone of Soviet victory. But it came at a cost so horrific that survivors rarely spoke of it. Many refused to ever step into a tank again. They'd walk around them, spit on the ground beside them, whispering, "You took too many of us." A battlefield made of fire. Under the relentless African sun, temperatures inside tanks could reach 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and that was before they were hit. Engines overheated constantly. Lubricants boiled away. Metal expanded so much that hatches jammed just from the heat. British crews fighting in Crusaders, Matildas, and Valentines called their vehicles baked coffins. When you climbed inside, you brought water, ammunition, and a kind of resignation. The understanding that if you died, your body might never be found. Only melted metal left behind. One veteran of the 8th Army remembered, "You didn't sweat. You steamed. You breathed in dust and you breathed out fear." The Crusader, fast, fragile, and fatal. The Crusader tank was Britain's main weapon early in the Desert War. It was fast, dangerously fast, but its armor was thin and its gun weak. Against Rommel's panzers, it was like sending glass against granite. When a Crusader was hit, it didn't always explode right away. The thin armor let shells punch clean through, turning the interior into a blender of molten metal and shrapnel. Men were often cut to pieces before the fire even started. Those who survived the initial hit rarely escaped the rest. Fuel lines ruptured. Catching the desert wind, the entire tank would light up like a torch. Crews who tried to climb out found themselves engulfed in flames the moment they opened the hatch. The dry desert air fed the fire like oxygen to a forge. A British tanker named George Langford wrote home in 1942. "You can't imagine the sound. It's not like a bomb or gunfire. It's a scream. The metal screaming as it burns. And you realize it's us inside doing the same." He was killed 2 weeks later when his Crusader was hit near Gazala. Matilda, the slow-moving coffin. The Matilda II, nicknamed the Queen of the Desert, had thick armor that made it nearly invulnerable in the early battles. But it had one fatal flaw. It was slow. So slow that it became a perfect target once. German 88-meter guns arrived in North Africa. Those guns could pierce even the Matilda's heavy plating, and once they did, the result was horrific. The Matilda's confined interior trapped the heat. The thick armor that once protected the crew now worked against them, keeping the fire sealed in. Crews sometimes cooked alive before the ammunition even detonated. By the time the flames melted through the armor, the men inside were already gone, blackened shapes fused to their controls. An Australian mechanic who inspected the wrecks after the Battle of Tobruk said, "When we opened the Matildas, we didn't see men. We saw shadows burned into the walls. The desert's other killer, the elements. The desert didn't need bullets to kill. The sand, the sun, and the thirst did the work just as well. Engines broke down constantly, leaving tanks stranded miles from friendly lines. Crews sat under the unrelenting sun, waiting for rescue that often never came. Fuel tanks ran dry, food spoiled, and water rationed to a few sips a day. There were cases of entire crews dying inside their tanks, not from combat, but from dehydration. Their bodies were found weeks later, still sitting in their seats, faces turned toward the empty horizon. German and British patrols sometimes stumbled upon these ghost tanks. Silent, empty, sun-bleached. No bullet holes, no fire marks, just men who had waited too long. The Desert Fox's playground. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, The Desert Fox turned the North African desert into his personal battlefield. His tactics were brilliant, his ambushes devastating. For tank crews on the Allied side, his name alone meant fear. Rommel's panzers would appear from the dunes without warning, strike fast and vanish before reinforcements could respond. For the British and Commonwealth crews, it was like fighting ghosts. One officer described it simply: "We never saw Rommel. We only saw what he left behind, burning tanks and black smoke. And yet, even Rommel's men paid the same price when the tables turned." The desert showed no favoritism. When German tanks burned, they burned just as fiercely. The sand became glass beneath them, the air tasting of oil and fire. When the desert itself caught fire, in 1942, during the First Battle of El Alamein, something terrible happened. A British shell struck a fuel convoy hidden behind a ridge. Dozens of trucks and tanks erupted into flames. The explosion was so massive that it ignited the desert sand itself, creating what soldiers described as a firestorm. Tanks caught in the blaze burned without ever being hit. Rubber melted, metal twisted, and the heat was so intense that gun barrels sagged like candles. One survivor from the 7th Armored Division said, "It was like the gates of hell had opened. Men ran out of their tanks, clothes on fire, screaming for water that wasn't there. When the fires died down, nothing was left but blackened shapes, the outlines of tanks etched into the ground like shadows burned into stone." The isolation of the tanker. In the desert, death came slowly and silently. There were no cities to hide in, no forests to run to. When a tank was hit, there was nowhere to go, just sand in every direction. A survivor of the 1st Royal Tank Regiment remembered, "If you made it out, you ran, not towards safety, because there was none, but just away. You didn't look back, because you could still hear the ones who didn't get out." Many tankers described the desert as the loneliest place on Earth. The wind buried their fallen comrades in minutes, leaving only the tips of gun barrels and helmets visible above the dunes. By the next day, even those were gone. The desert swallowed everything. Machines that melted. In some cases, the heat from burning tanks reached such extremes that entire turrets melted off their bases. Glass vision ports liquefied and ran down the sides like tears. The sand beneath turned into a thin crust of fused silica, desert glass, created by war. Engineers later discovered that the sand around destroyed tanks contained microscopic fragments of bone and steel fused together. Each one a tiny reminder of what war does when nature itself becomes the accomplice. Madness in the heat. Prolonged exposure to the desert sun, dehydration, and stress broke many tankers mentally. Some hallucinated enemy movement where there was none. Others started talking to their tanks as if they were living beings. In one British unit, a crew refused to abandon their disabled tank for 3 days, convinced it could still move. When rescuers arrived, they found 2 of them dead from heat stroke. The commander, delirious, whispering to the tank, "She just needs a rest. She'll go again soon." The desert didn't just kill the body, it boiled the mind. The sands of silence. After the North African campaign ended, hundreds of burned-out tanks were left behind. They stood there for years, rusting under the sun, silent memorials to the men inside. Nomads and locals avoided them, calling them the cursed machines. They said that on still nights, you could hear the metal creak, as if the tanks were sighing in their sleep. Some of those wrecks remain even today, buried halfway in the sand, their turrets frozen mid-turn, their guns pointing at nothing. Each one, a tomb for men who died under a sun that showed no mercy. Tanks in the jungle. Japan's armored forces were built for a different war, fast-moving. Infantry support in China, not all-out mechanized combat. When those same tanks were shipped to the Pacific Islands, they met conditions no engineer could have imagined. Their mainstay of the Type 95 Hago light tank weighed less than 8 tons. Its armor was so thin that even a heavy machine gun could pierce it. The crew inside, usually 3 men, fought in unbearable heat, stripped to their undershirts, drenched in sweat. The tropical humidity was relentless. Inside the tank, oxygen was scarce. Engines roared like furnaces, and exhaust fumes filled the compartment. Men sometimes fainted before the first shot was even fired. And when the fighting began, things got much worse. Death by fire and earth. In the jungle, visibility was everything, and tanks had none. Dense trees, tall grass, and hidden ravines meant tankers drove blind, relying on shouted directions from infantry outside. But when the infantry fell back, or died, the tanks became sitting targets. American Marines learned quickly. They didn't waste shells on the Japanese tanks. They got close, dangerously close, and used satchel charges. Bazookas and flamethrowers. Flamethrowers were the worst. A single burst into the ventilation grill could turn a tank into an oven. The fuel, thick, burning gel, stuck to everything. Seats, uniforms, skin. Men screamed, clawing at the inside of their hatches as the fire crawled over them. Some shot themselves before the flames reached their faces. At Saipan, eyewitnesses recalled Japanese tanks burning for hours, metal glowing red, smoke rising into the night like torches for the dead, trapped in their own defenses. When Japanese forces realized their tanks couldn't stand up to American Shermans, they changed tactics. They began burying their tanks. Crews would dig massive pits, drive their tanks in, and cover everything but the turret with dirt and foliage. The result was a stationary bunker, immovable, hidden, deadly. But when those buried tanks were discovered, the story ended horribly. The Americans would fire artillery, drop grenades, or simply pour fuel into the openings and ignite it. The crews inside, trapped, suffocating, couldn't escape even if they wanted to. The soil around them became their tomb. At Iwo Jima, entire platoons of Japanese tankers died buried alive in their own armor, the earth collapsing over them as the island burned above. After the war, U.S. recovery teams unearthed dozens of these tanks. When they opened the hatches, they found only bones, still sitting upright at their posts, helmets fused to skulls. The last stand on Iwo Jima. On February 19, 1945, the U.S. Marines landed on Iwo Jima, unaware that beneath the volcanic ash waited one of Japan's most determined defenses. The island's commander, General Kurebayashi, had buried tanks into the slopes, turning them into underground fortresses. When the fighting began, these tanks fired until their guns overheated, until their own engines exploded from the heat trapped beneath the surface. The crews didn't flee. They weren't allowed to. Japanese doctrine demanded no surrender. Even when their tanks were on fire, crews stayed inside, continuing to fire until the shells cooked off. Marines advancing through the smoke could hear the muffled detonations. Underground, like the heartbeat of a dying island. A Marine corporal later said, "You could feel the ground tremble and then it stopped. Just silence. You knew that meant another tank had died. And everyone inside it. When steel meets volcano. The volcanic soil of Iwo Jima and Palaliu made everything worse. The sulfuric gases corroded metal and clogged engines. When a tank burned, the fire didn't just consume, it fused. The heat welded armor plates shut, turning the tank into a sealed sarcophagus. After the battle, Japanese engineers who inspected the wrecks found the interiors. Coated in a thin, glassy layer, molten residue from both metal and human remains. The tropical moisture turned it black over time, preserving a grotesque monument inside each tank. It was said that even years later, when locals reopened those wrecks, they still smelled faintly of oil and death. How the sea takes its share. Not every Japanese tank was destroyed by fire or shells. Some were claimed by the ocean itself. During the Battle of the Philippines, retreating Japanese forces tried to move tanks across swampy terrain and shallow coastlines to avoid capture. Many bogged down in the mud, engines drowned by salt water. The crews tried to escape, but the suction held the tanks fast. Some climbed out, sinking knee-deep, waist-deep, then vanished. Others chose to stay inside, closing the hatches, waiting as the tide rose. When divers explored the wrecks decades later, they found the tanks upright, perfectly preserved, like coffins on the ocean floor. Skeletons still sat in their seats, hands on levers, helmets tilted forward as if still waiting for the command to move. The kamikaze crews. By 1945, Japan's armored units were desperate, their tanks obsolete, outgunned, outnumbered, and running out of fuel. They turned to a new kind of mission, suicidal defense. Some tank crews volunteered to load their vehicles with explosives and drive directly into American formations, detonating themselves to destroy enemy tanks. These suicide tanks were crude, often remote detonated by the driver himself. When they exploded, there was nothing left. No metal, no remains, just a crater. The soldiers who volunteered weren't fanatics. Many were simply hopeless. One diary recovered from a Japanese tank officer killed on Okinawa read, "My tank is old, my gun weak, my country dying. If my death can delay the Americans 1 hour, it is enough." He got his wish. His tank destroyed 2 Shermans before it vanished in flame. The silence after. Survivors of Japan's tank corps were rare, and those who lived carried silence with them for the rest of their lives. Many refused to talk about the war, ashamed of their defeats, haunted by their deaths. In Japanese culture, tankers were considered less heroic than the pilots or infantry. Their deaths less visible, their courage forgotten. But among those who knew, there was quiet reverence. A tank commander who survived the war said in 1965, "We were buried before we died. Our tanks were our graves before we entered them." That single line became the unofficial epitaph of Japan's armored dead, the jungle's tombs. Today, across the Pacific Islands, remnants of those tanks still lie where they fell. Some are half swallowed by vines, others rusting beside beaches where tourists walk unaware. If you listen closely in those jungles, locals say, you can still hear faint metallic creaks, the jungle reclaiming its ghosts. On some islands, villagers still leave offerings, small flowers or coins, at the rusted hulls, believing the spirits of the crews still linger inside. The tanks remain, not monuments of power, but reminders of futility. Machines meant for conquest, now devoured by the earth they once scarred. The city of ghosts, Stalingrad. The city that became synonymous with hell itself, Stalingrad. Winter, 1942. The snow was black with soot, the air thick with smoke and screams. Soviet T-34s and German panzers fought block by block, street by street, sometimes within the same ruined building. Tank battles at point-blank range, 20 meters apart, firing straight through walls. When a shell hit in those tight confines, the shock wave had nowhere to go. The pressure wave bounced back inside, turning the tank's interior into a blender of flame and shrapnel. Crewmen's lungs burst, ears bled, bodies thrown like dolls against steel walls. A German tanker described it simply. You could not tell where the tank ended and the city began. Everything burned, the houses, the machines, the men. Fire in the factories. One of the deadliest places in Stalingrad was the Red October factory, where Soviet tanks were still being assembled while battles raged around them. Workers and soldiers fought side by side. Some tanks went straight from the assembly line into combat, half-finished, still missing paint. When German artillery hit the plant, dozens of tanks caught fire inside the factory itself. The oil, paint, and gasoline ignited, an industrial inferno that turned the building into a cauldron. Men were trapped inside machines that had never even left the workshop. One survivor said, "The fire came from the ceiling. We couldn't see. The tanks burned where they stood, glowing like lanterns. The men inside never moved again. The tank as a coffin in the rubble. Urban warfare robbed tanks of their strength. Their turrets couldn't rotate fully. Their guns couldn't elevate properly. Infantry snuck up from basements, alleys, and windows. In Stalingrad, Soviet soldiers called it hunting the iron beasts. They'd wait with Molotov cocktails or anti-tank grenades, and when a German panzer rolled by, they'd leap from the ruins, hurling fire down its engine deck. The result was always the same. Smoke pouring from the hatches, then a blinding flash. Some crews tried to escape. Others locked themselves in and fought until the flames reached the ammo racks. When rescuers found them days later, the tanks were just shells, blackened, empty but somehow still alive with heat. Caen, the city that wouldn't die. Across the continent, 2 years later, another city suffered the same fate, Caen, France, 1944. When Allied tanks rolled in after D-Day, they faced German defenders dug into the rubble. The British Shermans tried to advance through narrow streets filled with debris and bodies. Every corner was a death trap, 80mm guns hidden in churches, Panzerfausts waiting behind shattered doorways. A single German shell could take out 3 tanks if they were too close together. Flames spread from wreck to wreck, igniting the city itself. For days, the streets of Caen burned, not from the air raids, but from the tanks themselves. A Canadian tanker recalled, "We couldn't tell if the screaming came from our men or theirs. When a tank caught fire, you knew. You could feel the heat even from the next street. The smell of oil, flesh, and smoke lingered for weeks." Locals said the cobblestones stayed warm long after the last battle ended. Warsaw, machines in a dying city. In 1944, as the Warsaw Uprising erupted, German tanks once again entered a city already in ruins. But this time it wasn't soldiers they faced. It was civilians. Resistance fighters armed with homemade explosives. The insurgents called the tanks monsters of the devil, and they hunted them from rooftops, sewers, and cellars. They dropped bottles of gasoline onto the thin armor of German Panzer IVs, wedging grenades into their tracks. One infamous incident became legend. A captured German tank, taken by Polish fighters, was loaded unknowingly with explosives by the Germans as a trap. When it was driven into a crowd of civilians celebrating the capture, it detonated, killing hundreds instantly. The fire burned for 2 days. For those who lived, the sound of a tank engine in the streets became a symbol of death itself, the human cost of urban steel. Inside cities, tanks lost their speed, their visibility, their advantage. Every wall, every window, every sewer was an enemy. The crews fought blind, deafened by their own engines and terrified by every shadow. A U.S. tank commander in Aachen described it best. "You're in a metal box, can't see 10 feet, and every sound could be someone about to kill you. It's not courage that keeps you going, it's terror." Urban tank deaths were slow and personal. You didn't die to a shell you never saw. You died with the enemy's face close enough to see, his eyes as he threw fire through your hatch. Tanks turned to traps. In many cases, destroyed tanks in cities became traps for others. Wrecks blocked narrow roads, forcing new units to climb over the burning hulks. Engines stalled, shells misfired, and traffic jams of death formed, entire streets clogged with burning armor. When night fell, the glow from the fires lit up the sky. In some cities, people said you could see the red horizon from 20 miles away, not from bombs, but from tanks dying by the hundreds. The crews who escaped often went mad from what they saw. One British soldier wrote, "When the hatch opened, I saw the loader's body, but his face wasn't there anymore. Just the helmet. I shut it again." Civilians in the crossfire. In cities like Stalingrad and Warsaw, civilians were trapped alongside the tanks. When the machines caught fire, the flames spread into homes. Fuel leaks ran down gutters, igniting entire streets. Children and families died in the same fires as tank. Crews burned together in nameless graves of ash. After the war, survivors in Stalingrad spoke of the smell of iron and meat. For months, the rubble was still hot enough to burn bare feet. The line between soldier and civilian, between weapon and victim, had disappeared completely. The psychological collapse. Tankers who fought in cities suffered nightmares for the rest of their lives. Many described dreams where they were trapped, pounding on metal walls, smoke filling their lungs. For some, even city traffic decades later, the echo of engines between buildings brought panic attacks. An American Sherman commander said in 1968, "Every time I drive downtown and the car windows fog up, I see Caen again. I smell it, I feel it. You never leave the tank." Not really. The war had ended, but for those who fought in cities, the tank was still with them, a ghost of steel following them into peace. Cities of the dead. When the guns fell silent, what remained were ghost towns of armor, burned-out tanks in doorways, half-buried under collapsed walls, their crews entombed within. In Stalingrad, bulldozers simply pushed the wrecks into pits and covered them over. No one had time to remove the bodies. They're still there, beneath apartment blocks, factories, playgrounds, men sleeping in iron graves under the cities they died to destroy. A historian once wrote, "Europe rebuilt itself on bones and steel. The foundations of its cities are made of tanks and men." And he was right. We stay together. The creed of the crew. A tank wasn't just a weapon. It was a family of 5 men sharing one heartbeat. The commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator, each depending on the others completely. If one failed, they all died. This bond was unbreakable even when the fire came. A U.S. tanker, Staff Sergeant William Archer, wrote after the war, "When the flames hit, the commander shouted, 'Out!' I looked at him and said, 'Not without you.' He was pinned under the turret. I tried, but he was trapped. So I sat there with him until the fire came. Archer was found alive outside the tank hours later, burned. Delirious, the skin on his hands gone. He never forgave himself for leaving his commander's body behind." The Soviet charge at Prokhorovka. On July 12, 1943, at Prokhorovka, one of the fiercest battles of the Kursk offensive. Hundreds of Soviet tanks charged headlong into the German lines. They knew they were outgunned. They knew the German Tigers could destroy them from twice their range. But retreat was not an option. So they rammed. Soviet T-34s slammed full speed into German Panthers, crushing barrels, jamming turrets, and exploding point blank. Crews detonated their own tanks rather than surrender. One T-34 was seen driving through flames, its hull already on fire, its gun still firing until the heat detonated its ammo. A survivor later said, "They did not die screaming. They died shouting, 'For the motherland!'" It was madness and heroism woven into one, a sacrifice that broke the German advance that day. The desert's final gamble, El Alamein, in North Africa, 1942. A British tank unit known as the Desert Rats made a last stand at El Alamein. Outnumbered, outflanked, and surrounded by Rommel's forces, they held their ground. When the order came to withdraw, one tank, callsign Faithful 2, refused. The commander, Captain Robert Haynes, radioed simply, "Tell my wife, this is as far as I go." His Crusader tank fought for nearly 20 minutes alone, taking hit after hit until the ammunition exploded. When Allied forces returned after the battle, they found the tank still in place, a blackened wreck. Inside, all three crewmen were seated upright, burned where they sat, hands still on their controls. Their remains were buried in the sand beside their tank. A small wooden cross was nailed to the barrel. It read, "They stayed." The Panzer at Arnhem, in September 1944. During Operation Market Garden, a German Panzer IV crew found themselves cut off near Arnhem Bridge. Their unit had fallen back, but they refused to leave their position, knowing British paratroopers were advancing. For hours they fought alone, firing until their gun barrel warped from heat. When ammunition ran out, they loaded signal flares and fired them like shells, desperate to keep the enemy at bay. As British troops closed in, one of the crew, the radio operator, detonated the tank's internal charges. The explosion destroyed the bridge approach, halting the Allied advance for nearly half a day. No one inside survived. The official report from the British side read simply, "Enemy tank destroyed itself rather than surrender. Crew perished with honor. Even their enemies respected the choice." The American last stand at Bastogne. Winter 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. Snow, smoke, and chaos. A Sherman tank unit from the 10th Armored Division was holding the southern road into Bastogne, trying to buy time for the 101st Airborne. When they ran out of shells, their commander, Lt. Harold Hal McNeil, told his men to load whatever they could find. Smoke, flares, even spare machine gun belts. German armor surrounded them. One tank caught fire immediately, its engine a torch against the snow. Another took a direct hit, losing its track. McNeil's own Sherman was burning, his gunner already dead, the loader screaming in the back. He stayed inside, turning the turret manually by hand, firing one last round that knocked out a German half-track. Moments later, his ammunition exploded. When the snow melted in spring, locals found the remains of the Sherman still there, turret blown off, its cannon pointed east. They left it as a monument. A plaque was added later. He would not leave his gun. The tiger's den, when the hunters were hunted. Even among the German tank corps, there were stories of defiance. In 1945, near the town of Halbe, a Tiger I commanded by Karl Müller found itself surrounded by Soviet infantry. The rest of his platoon was destroyed, fuel nearly gone. He ordered his men to abandon the tank. They refused. For 6 hours, they fought from the same position, the Tiger's massive 88mm cannon thundering until the gun breech jammed from heat. When the Soviets finally reached the wreck, the tank was still smoldering. Inside, the 5-man crew lay together side by side. On the tank's exterior, scratched into the armor with a knife, were 2 words in German: Wir bleiben. We stay. Suicide runs of steel. Desperation made men do the unthinkable. In the final months of the war, both Axis and Allied tankers carried out suicide runs, charging enemy positions to protect retreating troops or delay advances. One U.S. tank in Germany, hit 3 times in a blaze, drove straight into an enemy machine gun nest, crushing it before exploding. A Soviet IS-2 in Berlin rammed a Tiger II head-on, destroying both in a single blast. In each case, the crews knew exactly what they were doing. These were not accidents. They were acts of defiance, final gestures of control in a world where everything else had been taken from them. The code of the dying crew. Across every army, every language, there were unwritten rules among tankers. If one of you was trapped, the others tried to get you out, no matter what. If you couldn't be saved, you made it quick. If the tank was lost, you destroyed it before the enemy could take it. A Soviet veteran summarized it best. We feared burning more than dying, but we feared leaving our brothers even more. Those words were echoed by Americans, Germans, Britons, all men who knew the feeling of steel closing around them, of the world narrowing to the glow of the fire and the sound of screaming metal. The last fires of Berlin. In April 1945, as Berlin fell, the city was a furnace. Soviet tanks roared through the ruins, while the last German defenders, mostly boys and old men, fought in the streets. In one of the final tank engagements, a German Panther blocked a bridge leading to the Reichstag. Out of ammunition and surrounded, the crew could have surrendered. Instead, they turned their gun toward the bridge and waited. When the Soviets appeared, they fired their last shell, then detonated the tank, collapsing the bridge and halting the advance for hours. The explosion was so massive that it cracked nearby buildings. The Panther's turret was found 50 meters away. None of the crew survived, but their stand became a final, tragic symbol of the German Armored Corps' loyalty, not to Hitler, but to each other. Why they stayed. It's easy to call them mad, men who chose death in machines already doomed. But listen closely to their letters, their diaries, their surviving comrades, and you'll hear something deeper. They stayed not out of fanaticism, but love, the purest, most desperate kind. Love for the men beside them, for the machine that had carried them through so much, for the belief that if they had to die, they would die together. One American tanker wrote before Normandy, "If I burn with my brothers. If we die, we'll die as one machine, 5 hearts, 1 fire." He was killed 3 days after landing. His tank was found half buried in the hedgerows, the hatch still closed. The silence after the fire. When the fighting stopped, thousands of tankers returned home. They carried medals, scars, and the weight of things no one else could understand. They had seen friends burn alive inches away from them, heard screams echo inside metal walls, smelled human flesh melting into the armor they once trusted to protect them. And when they tried to speak of it, people didn't believe them. How could they? To most, tanks were symbols of victory. To the men who fought in them, they were reminders of every sound, every smell, every death that lived inside their heads. A British veteran said in 1957, "I can still hear the hiss when the fire starts. I smell oil and blood in my sleep. You don't leave the tank, it follows you." The flashbacks that never stopped. Many survivors described waking up in the middle of the night, choking, their hands clawing for a hatch that wasn't there. They'd dream of being trapped, hearing the shell strike, the sudden light, the screams that followed. Doctors called it shell shock at first, later combat fatigue. Today we call it PTSD. But back then, there was no treatment, no understanding, only whiskey, nightmares, and silence. Wives would find their husbands sitting in the dark garage, hours after midnight, just staring at the family car. One said her husband couldn't drive again after the war. The enclosed space made him panic. He'd start screaming for someone to open the hatch. That was 20 years after he left Europe. The survivor's guilt. Survivors carried another wound, one that couldn't be seen. Guilt. For every man who walked away from a burning tank, there were 4 who didn't. And those who lived often wondered, why me? An American tanker, John Davies, wrote in his diary in 1946, "Every morning I see their faces. I remember the ones who didn't get out. I can still smell them. I should have been in that seat. Sometimes I wish I was." He never told his family what he meant by that line. But his son later said his father couldn't stand campfires. The smell made him cry. The disconnect. For tankers, normal life after the war was like living on another planet. Noise and the slamming of a car door, the backfire of an engine, could send them diving for cover. The hum of machinery brought back the sound of engines rumbling in confined space. Even rain tapping on rooftops could sound like distant gunfire. They tried to fit in. They worked jobs, raised families, smiled for photos. But inside, they carried the echo of every man who burned, screamed, or vanished beside them. The world moved on, but they never did. The survivors who couldn't survive. Some couldn't bear the memories. They turned to drink. Others simply withdrew, choosing isolation over explanation. A German panzer commander, years after the war, wrote in his memoir, "We had no nightmares in the tank, only afterward. In the dark, when the silence came, the fire started again, in our heads." In small villages across Europe, old tankers were found sitting in their gardens, eyes closed, hands twitching like they were still gripping the controls. Neighbors said they talked to themselves in their sleep, mumbling orders, shouting for someone to open the hatch. Many took their stories to the grave without ever telling a soul. The invisible wounds of heroism. Governments called them heroes. But the men themselves didn't feel heroic. They didn't talk about medals or victories. They talked about who they couldn't save, the friends who never made it out, the ones who burned beside them, the ones who screamed and then went silent. A Soviet veteran of Kursk said in 1960, "People ask how many Germans I killed. I don't know, but I know how many of us I buried. The machines that haunted them. Even the sight of a tank could be unbearable. Some couldn't look at war memorials. Others refused to attend reunions because the sound of engines made their hands shake." In post-war America, museums displayed Shermans as symbols of freedom. But veterans visiting those displays sometimes broke down. They'd run their fingers over the cold steel and whisper the names of their crews. One curator in the 1970s said, "Every year we get old men who touch the tanks and cry. They don't say why. They don't have to. The fire that never died." For some, the fire wasn't just memory. It became a presence. They smelled it in dreams. They saw it in the reflection of windows, in the orange of sunsets, in the glow of cigarettes. One veteran described it this way, "When the sun hits metal just right, I see it. The tank, burning again, always burning." His wife said he never slept more than an hour at a time. He'd wake up gasping, hands shaking, whispering names she didn't recognize. He lived to 82. He never once talked about the war, the bonds that saved them. Yet amidst the pain, some found solace in the only people who truly understood. Reunions of tank crews became sacred gatherings. Men who hadn't seen each other in decades embraced like brothers. They didn't need to talk about the war. The look in their eyes said enough. One American crew met every year until the last of them passed away. When one died, the others placed a small piece of steel from their old. Sherman in his coffin, a piece of the tank that had kept them alive and nearly killed them. They called it bringing him home. The weight of the hatch. Psychologists who studied tank veterans after the war noticed something haunting. Many of them developed claustrophobia, the fear of enclosed spaces. Elevators, tunnels, even cars triggered panic attacks. But it wasn't just the space. It was the memory of being sealed in. The sound of the hatch closing, that final, metallic thud haunted them more than the sound of any shell or explosion. One British veteran said in an interview, "That sound and the hatch closing, that's the sound of dying. You never forget it." Even decades later, that sound could make his whole body tremble. Healing, or something like it. For many, healing never really came. But some found meaning by sharing their stories, by warning others, by building peace from the ashes of war. They visited schools, museums, memorials, telling young people what it meant to live inside a tank. Not the glory, not the victories, but the reality. The fear, the fire, the friendship, and the price. One old man said at a museum dedication in 1992, "If they call us heroes, fine. But remember, heroes burn too. The men are gone now. The tanks are rusting in fields and museums. But their stories remain, etched into steel, carved into memory, whispered through generations." In the final part, we bring it all together. The machines, the men, and the lessons their deaths left behind. Because to understand the cost of war, You must understand what it means to die inside steel. The engines are silent now. The guns have gone cold. The wrecks that once burned like suns on the battlefield are nothing more than rusting bones scattered across the earth. But the stories and the screams, the courage, the fear, they linger. You can almost hear them if you listen closely. The whispers of the men who fought and died inside their steel tombs. Fields of ghosts. Across Europe, the ground is still littered with reminders of the war. In France, farmers plowing their fields still strike something hard. A buried tread, a shell casing, a twisted fragment of armor. Sometimes they find more. Inside those rusted hulks, archaeologists still uncover the remains of tank crews. Bones fused to seats. Dog tags melted into steel. 80 years later, the war is still giving up its dead. Each discovery is more than history. It's a heartbeat from the past. A reminder that every machine once carried living, breathing men who laughed, fought, and feared just like us. The machines of men. We like to think of tanks as symbols of power, indestructible, unfeeling, perfect. But they were never perfect. They broke down. They burned. They failed. And yet they carried some of the bravest souls who ever lived. Men who climbed willingly into cages of fire. Men who faced death not once, but every time that hatch closed. They weren't fighting for flags or politics. They were fighting for the man beside them. The loader who cracked jokes to hide his fear. The driver who never looked up. The commander who whispered, "Hold fast." That's what the tank really was. Not a weapon of steel, but a bond of flesh. Lessons from the fire. From the Shermans that burned like lanterns in Normandy, to the panzers that crushed their own crews in retreat, to the T-34s that froze in the Russian snow, their crews still inside. Every tank tells the same story, that human courage exists even in the most inhuman conditions. These men didn't die clean. They didn't die quickly. But in their final moments, covered in oil and flame, they showed the truest face of bravery. They didn't run. They fought. They stayed. What war really costs. War isn't the sound of victory. It's the silence that follows. The silence of fathers who never came home. The silence of wives waiting for letters that never arrived. The silence of empty chairs in kitchens across every nation that fought. The war ended in 1945. But for the families of tankers, it never really did. Even decades later, some widows still refused to buy new cars. They said the smell of gasoline made them cry. The courage beyond fear. It takes courage to charge into battle, but it takes a different kind of courage to sit inside a tank. To know you're in a coffin of steel and still keep fighting. Those men weren't superheroes. They were terrified. And that's what makes their courage real. Because bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's doing your duty despite it. Every tanker who turned the ignition, who manned the gun, who stayed when he could have run, he was writing a story that the world must never forget. The eternal rest of steel. All across the world, rusting tanks remain, silent memorials to the men who never escaped them. In Normandy's fields, they're covered in moss. In Russia, they lie half buried in frozen soil. In the Pacific, coral has claimed them, turning war machines into reefs of life. Time has softened their edges, but their purpose remains to remind us what war really is. Not medals, not parades, just sacrifice. When the wind blows through their open hatches, it almost sounds like breathing. Perhaps it's the souls of the men who never made it out, still whispering, "Remember us," the meaning of the machines. Look at a tank today, cold, still harmless in a museum. It's easy to forget the terror it once carried. But inside that steel, history still lives. The smell of smoke, the crackle of fire, the trembling hands of a boy who didn't want to die but stayed anyway. He's still there, in the dents and scars of the metal. He's still there every time we say freedom without remembering what it cost. Their legacy. The tankers of World War II gave more than their lives. They gave us a lesson written in iron. That courage can exist even in the darkest, smallest place imaginable, inside a box of steel surrounded by fire. They taught us that even when machines fail, humanity doesn't have to. They were young men from every side, from every country. And though they fought each other, they all shared one truth. The fire didn't care about their flags. In death, they were the same. Brothers of steel, sons of war. The final words. Soft piano music fades in, haunting, beautiful, slow. When you see an old tank someday in a museum, In a field, rusting quietly in the rain, don't just see a weapon, see a tomb. See the faces of the men who sat inside it, who breathed its smoke, who fought and died believing their sacrifice would end something terrible. Maybe it did. Maybe it didn't. But they deserve to be remembered, not as heroes of war, but as men of unimaginable courage who met death in the loneliest place on earth, inside steel.